Somebody had to say it. As our countries grapple with an influx of illegal immigration, there's some bitter yet vital truths that we need to be speaking to ourselves. That's exactly what Konstantin Kisin has done, and it's incredible how well the truths he lays out map onto the immigration debate in the US as much as they do in the UK. But I think it'll make you realize something else as well, which is that the failure of our politicians to understand and implement a better immigration policy can't just be down to pure ignorance, but perhaps something more sinister that we need to talk about. Subscribe to the channel for more discussions like this, and watch Konstantin lay out the hard truth before we dive in.
When I came to Britain in 1995, 3% of the British public thought that immigration was a major issue. 3%. By 2015, this figure was 56%. 56%. 3% to 56% in 20 years. This required explanation, and fortunately our media had one. They said to us in that period of time that the reason that the British public went from not caring about immigration to thinking it's one of the most serious issues facing this country in that period of time was racism. According to these people, Britain became 1,800% more racist between 1995 and 2015, which is about as plausible as Vladimir Putin's election result, or the idea that Jeffrey Epstein killed himself. What actually happened, of course, had nothing to do with racism and everything to do with reality. The reality that shortly after I came to this country in 1997, you enthusiastically elected one Tony Blair, who threw open the borders of this country. And if you think that's an exaggeration, you probably don't know that more people came into this country under the Blair government than had come into Britain between 1066, the Battle of Hastings, and 1950. More people came into Britain in 11 years under Blair than had come in 9 centuries. That's the scale of immigration we've seen.
I think there's a reason for that. For much of the last 15 years of our political discourse, we failed to detach the discussion of immigration from race from both ends of the political spectrum, and that's practically shutting the doors on any rational conversation happening over the topic in the first place. From the right, anti-immigration rhetoric has too often taken the flavor of xenophobia and actual racism because the rational right wing has not put up the strong enough case, while on the other end, accusations of racism have been used by the left to shut down critics of immigration policy both in the UK and the US, and what's left is a vacuum of conversation where the political platform on the subject is left open to the fringes on both sides, and that political deadlock and paralysis has persisted even as the borders remain more porous than they've ever been. I think what Konstantin is doing here is ingenious because that's the first step to reclaiming the conversation on immigration.
I love ice cream, but if you forced me to eat ice cream every day for 30 years, I'd get annoyed. Fat, diabetic, and annoyed. Not least because then I wouldn't be British, I'd be American. The British people have voted to lower immigration to the tens of thousands where it was when I first here, over and over and over again. It doesn't matter whether you, I, Polly, Aaron, or anybody else thinks immigration should go up or down or should stay where it is. There is no mandate for what has happened in this country over the last 30 years, and there is no mandate in this country for what is happening today. There is no consent. It's anti-democratic and wrong and immoral. The second reason is scale. I love ice cream, but as I keep trying and failing to explain to my toddler, there is an amount of ice cream you can eat, and that's limited. Last year, net migration, as Katie mentioned, into this country was nearly 700,000 people in 1 year. Now, in the words of a man I'm sure our opponents greatly admire, quantity has a quality all of its own. Joseph Stalin. 700 people a year is not a number of people that we can credibly attempt to assimilate. It's not, and we're not doing this, by the way, because it benefits our country. We're doing this because it allows politicians to pretend that they're boosting economic growth in the short term. Like a toddler shoveling ice cream down his throat for the instant gratification, we are pretending there are no long-term consequences. And Matt will talk about some of those in a second. The third reason, and this is the great unsayable of the immigration debate, is that not all immigrants are the same. There are 10 times as many Polish people in this country as there are Albanians. And yet the number of Albanians in prison is almost twice that of Polish people. Not all immigrants are the same. We welcomed over 150,000 people from Hong Kong into this country a few years ago. There are no Hong Kongese grooming gangs. We welcomed 200,000 Ukrainians. They're not running around the streets of London stabbing each other. Not all immigrants are the same. Culture, family structure, religion, ethnic background and values, these things matter. Pretending otherwise doesn't help.
See what I mean? That's exactly the thin line between race and culture that much of the right wing on the immigration debate has failed to walk. Race is an immutable characteristic that's completely irrelevant to the discussion. But culture is a set of learned behaviors that may or may not align with the host nations, which is something that can and should be talked about separate from race. I think it's something Jordan Peterson has often spoken about. The truth is that every nation and society on Earth is undergirded by a set of philosophical presumptions about the world and humans. In the Western canon, those presumptions are individualism, the sanctity of free speech and personal liberty, and the pursuit of happiness as the greatest ideal and vehicle to success. The mistake that the far left of the immigration debate makes is to assume that these philosophical underpinnings are shared by everyone across the world, but they are really not. A lot of cultures around the world are built on collectivist notions where free speech and liberty are not more important than their collective idea of good. And I'm not saying there's something wrong with that, but it's true that those are two different ends of the spectrum of philosophy, and they are bound to clash when they're mixed together. And when you look at it, it's actually a form of gradual cultural evolution that some nations happen to be further along than others. And that's okay, because even the West has taken thousands of years of evolution to settle on our fundamental notions of individualism, rationalism, and the government is subservient to the people. That's part of the reason why the democracy experiment fails in so many parts of the world. Someone on the left may tell you you can simply export democracy into a place like China or Saudi Arabia where those philosophical presumptions don't exist and democracy will simply start to function as in the West, but it doesn't work that way, and it didn't work in a place like Afghanistan either, despite US presence in the country for over 2 decades. Obviously, this is a subject that not a lot of people are willing to talk about because it needs to tread the fine line between race and culture, which too many people cannot do.
We currently spend £8 million a day on hotels for illegal immigrants. £8 million a day. Now, I'm sure the majority of these people are normal people who are here to seek a better life. But there is no reason they should be coming here against our will and breaking rules that everybody else has to respect. Not least because not all of them are normal people coming here for a better life. Some of them are Abdul Yazidi. I love ice cream, but if ice cream started running around sexually assaulting people and throwing corrosive substances on women and their children, I'd be against it. So to sum up, our position on immigration in this country is best summarized by one of my favorite quotes, which is this: you can ignore reality, but you cannot ignore the consequences of ignoring reality. And that's where we are. Thank you very much.
That hits the nail on the head, and we figured that out in the US as more than 10 million illegal immigrants have entered the United States in just the 3.5 years of the Biden presidency. It really makes you wonder why this one political policy would be stuck on the far left despite calls for immigration policy to be brought back to a reasonable center, and perhaps the only explanation is that it could be deliberate, forced upon by the powerful corporate lobbies and interest groups that benefit from an onslaught of illegal migration, lower wages, and the disruption that comes with it. Those interest groups understand one thing about money: making money is a hard and slow process when there's law and peace. But it's much easier and quicker in chaos. But as we're in the middle of finding out, the system that we've built and the welfare safety nets that keep functioning are in fact very fragile ecosystems that cannot be disturbed, and the only thing stopping that is borders, not just physically, but also conceptually. Jordan Peterson once laid that out as the cardinal difference between the political left and right.
One of the things that really differs between liberals and conservatives, between the left and the right right likes tight borders between things. It's part of being conscientious at every level: conceptually, sexually, familially, provincially, nationally. The right says, look, let's keep the borders between things pretty distinct. And the left says, yeah, maybe not, because some of those borders are in the wrong place and a little bit more free flow of information wouldn't be a bad thing. And the thing is, they're right, but so are the conservatives, and that's why you have to talk. It's like, well, we've got some borders. That's a good thing. Maybe some of them need to be moved around a little bit, and that's what the political dialogue is for. But that doesn't mean that borders themselves are a bad idea. They're a great idea, because without borders, everything mashes into the same untenable state of undifferentiated chaos, and you can't live in that. It should not be assumed that citizens of societies that have not evolved functional individual rights predicated polities will hold values in keeping with such polities. So we could say, look, there are a lot of countries in the world that are not governed well. The vast majority of them, right? And they've been not governed well forever. And to me, that means that there's something wrong with the values that are held collectively by the people who've established those polities. Well, you shouldn't be naive and assume that merely because you move them to a new country, they're going to let their innate democratic longings flourish. It doesn't work that way.
And that's why both Jordan Peterson and Konstantin Kisin are great examples of people that are best positioned to articulate a politically conservative case for immigration policy. And the only way to do that is to not be afraid of pointing out the excesses of both ends of the spectrum. Let me know in the comments how you can do that in individual lives, because detaching the dialogue on immigration from the race-baiting fringes on either side is the first step toward a more rational and productive conversation on the issue.